Good afternoon. My name is Glenda Silva, and I am Deputy Director of Programs and Strategic Alliances at Brooklyn Borough Hall. I want to thank everyone who is attending today's session. There are just some ground rules I would like to cover before we formally start. This session will be recorded and broadcasted on Brick TV at a later date. All attendees will be muted and video settings will be turned off. Guest speakers will introduce themselves shortly and speak on the impact of COVID as it relates to their specialization. Prior to this session, we have received a few questions from constituents, and my colleague, Denise Brown, will assist me in highlighting those questions so that we can ask them at the end of the discussion. If you do have a question during this session, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat function. If your question was not addressed, please, if your question was not addressed during the session, please email your inquiry at askeric@brooklynbp.nyc.gov. And before we begin, I would like to just share a special message from Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams.
Hello, I'm Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams. By now, maybe you've heard my life-changing health story, how I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, had nerve damage and sight loss. But I was able to reverse my conditions by adopting a whole food, plant-based diet. And I'm committed to sharing information about the advantages of whole grains, beans, vegetables, fruit, nuts, and seeds into a daily diet. I've enjoyed sharing my Digital Wellness Wednesdays series with so many Brooklynites and New Yorkers. The series features doctors from around Brooklyn who specialize in general medicine, internal medicine, emergency medicine, and more. And because of your enthusiastic response, I'm here to announce that we're now expanding the series to include an additional element, the Mind, Body, Soul edition. This three-part edition includes experts bringing you interactive information and addresses mental, physical, and nutrition-related questions. It also features a dietitian who can help you jumpstart your own plant-based nutrition regimen with yoga, cardio, and cooking demonstrations. So I invite you to start or continue your wellness journey with me. Join my info-packed webinars, Wellness Wednesdays, the Mind, Body, Soul edition. And please tell a friend. I hope to see you there.
Thank you, and I'm going to admit just a few more guests joining us on the session. Thank you very much. For those who are just joining us, again, please make sure your audio and video settings are off. We are only featuring our speakers for today. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Nate Trafinski, who will be the moderator and will introduce our doctors for today. Nate?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks, Glenda, for the opening and for the remarks from the Borough President. Yeah, as discussed, the Wellness Wednesday series continues now with today's edition on mental health. The coronavirus has affected all of us in many ways, and mental health has certainly not been excluded. So we're so pleased to have Drs. Gordon Frankel and Andrea Henry with us from the NYU system. And so I'll have them introduce themselves and their specialty areas, and perhaps you can each talk about how the pandemic has affected your day-to-day work, some engagement and platforms you use to now engage with your patients and clients, and some just top-line things you've seen throughout the last 5 or 6 months that you might want to share to open the discussion, and then we can get into some question and answer after that.
Thank you so much, Nate. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'll go first, and then I'll pass over to Dr. Henry So as Nate mentioned, we're from the NYU system. I sit in the hospital and I oversee psychiatry on the Brooklyn campus for NYU. And our system is fairly large. We have a hospital-based system, and then we have an outpatient system, which is part of the family health centers at NYU Langone. That's a very large behavioral health program where we have a main clinic at 49th Street in Brooklyn, and then we have behavioral health social workers based in school sites, as well as in some of the primary care clinics and some of the homeless clinics throughout Brooklyn. So we see a wide range of different illnesses and phases of illness for people with psychiatric and mental health issues. So to talk, so I know this, today we're going to focus a bit on, or completely on COVID and the mental health implications and impacts of that. But I do want to welcome anyone who wants to put a question in that's unrelated to COVID to feel free to do that. This pandemic has caused really a dramatic change in how we deliver mental health and behavioral health care. When back in March when this started, all of our visits were really face-to-face in our outpatient clinic and in our hospital. And in the course of over one week, we transitioned our outpatient clinic to be really entirely virtual. So the majority of visits that we're doing and connections we're doing with our patients in our outpatient setting are either via video link, a video conference link with the patient and the clinician, either the social worker, psychologist, or psychiatrist, or a telephone if necessary. We do still do some face-to-face visits and on-site visits, but the video links are working quite well for providing care and making sure we're connecting with our patients the way we need to. So that's one thing that's really changed since COVID started, has been really how we deliver care. It's been a big shift. It's something that we had been trying to kind of slowly ramp up prior to COVID, and that COVID just completely took over and transitioned us to really be an entirely virtual service for the most part. The other thing which we've dealt with in our service, first of all, on the hospital side, we are working with a large number of individuals who are frontline workers here in the hospital, coming in every day and lived through the crisis and the real surge we had in March and April. And we're on the front lines, working long hours, either fear of being infected themselves, fear of infecting their families, coming home from work. So one big part of our work over the last several months has been to ensure that we have the resources in the hospital to support those frontline workers that are here serving the patients with COVID and all the patients that came into our hospital. So that's been another area of focus that's been a bit of a shift for our service. And then more recently, what we're starting to see is an increased number of individuals reaching out for mental health treatment and mental health evaluations as this crisis has progressed, as the acute really wave and surge in New York has eased up in April, May, June until now. We're starting to notice people coming in with more anxiety, more depression, more stress, as they're struggling with difficulties with employment, finances, jobs. Isolation is a big issue for many people, not connecting to their social networks as much as they used to. And the patients that we serve oftentimes don't have the technology or the finances to buy the technology to connect to family members and friends via Zoom or other mechanisms. And then finally, and this is where I'll pass it over to Dr. Henry, is with the heading back to school happening now or happening in the near future, there's been a whole lot of focus on child well-being and child stress and children's ability to manage through this crisis, whether they're on-site at school or whether they're doing their schooling remotely. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Dr. Henry to allow her to speak a little bit on that, because that's her area of expertise.
Thank you, Dr. Frankel. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Dr. Andrea Henry. I am a clinical psychologist, and I work out of, as Dr. Frankel says, one of the family health centers. Our 49th Street site provides the most. We have the largest kind of like behavioral health services out of that site. And as the biggest adjustment or transition definitely has been to providing teleservices versus, and it really transitioned quite quickly. And it has been very effective despite the quick change that we've seen for providers, you know, for staff, as well as the family and patients that we care for. And obviously, you know, they're especially at the beginning of the crisis, right, in the acute phase, there was definitely, understandably, more anxiety, right? It makes sense that that's going to be the reaction. You know, our body's preparing for this threat, and there was so much news constantly being bombarded, and so there was, and kids changing, you know, being home from school and staying, you know, stay-at-home orders, and parents having to transition. So there were so many shifts. And one of the things that was so discreet about COVID is it wasn't just kind of the patients that we serve, it was also affecting, you know, staff and, you know, the agency as a whole, you know, as it will, you know, as it does everyone else. And so we definitely, one of the nice things about the transition to telehealth though was the easier access. It did provide that there was, we were able to transition to continue to provide that service, that very needed service, without any huge gaps in care. And it actually, for many of our families that we've served, has eased the barrier, you know, in terms of like traveling, you know, availability of when they were able to kind of like, you know, meet for an appointment, the ease of scheduling appointments. So it has been, it's been a big change. And, you know, it has, it's been amazing though to see the staff and all the work that they've done to kind of like help to, you know, continue to provide our families and the kids that we serve. I primarily oversee the child and adolescent outpatient services at the clinic at Sunset Terrace. And so we've continued to see an increase in our referrals and new patients that we're seeing, in addition to increased frequency of visits from the patients that we were already seeing before COVID. And, you know, typically the things that we're seeing in terms of presenting problems, you know, anxiety, depression, substance use, you know, those are some of the things that we're seeing before, then with the added element of the stressor that COVID provided. So I'll just kind of like pause it there and like we can start for any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for giving a background and sort of setting the scene as to what you've seen and some of the avenues through which people can receive care. I know a prominent question always is reimbursement and insurance. And so if each of you could just speak about, I know there's been some Centers for Medicare and Medicaid regulations that have been relaxed to make telephonic and telemedicine more feasible over the last few months. And that was extended some, but perhaps you can read the audience into how that sits when you engage with patients and how their reimbursements are, and how you see this kind of continuing. Should we still be in the same health situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a difficult area. I mean, I think that, you know, so our clinic serves largely Medicaid, Medicare population, or managed Medicaid population, and some underinsured or uninsured patients. As a federally qualified health center, we accept all patients regardless of insurance. So even if someone doesn't have insurance, they will get treatment in our clinic. As you pointed out, Nate, the government, the state, and the feds have relaxed the regulations on telephonic treatment so that the reimbursement rates are the same for telephonic as they would be for face-to-face visits during this emergency, which has been wonderful for us as an organization. It's allowed us to continue the care we're providing without having to be anxious that we're going to go into a large financial hole while providing that care. So that's at least one part of the puzzle that we don't have to become worried about when we're doing this treatment, the video visits and the televisits. You know, it's kind of anyone's guess what will happen with that moving forward. We're working with Greater New York Hospital Association to really try to continue and advocate for this to be able to continue, at least for behavioral health. I mean, behavioral health really has a strong case for allowing video and telephone visits to be part of the regular treatment and being reimbursed at that same rate, given that we typically don't do physical exams, we're not doing blood draws with our patients at the time we're seeing them. We might ask for that and they'll go in and get that later. But to do psychotherapy, to do medication management for a psychiatrist or therapy for a clinician, a psychologist, or a social worker, seeing the patient helps. So video is probably better than telephone, but you can do it via telephone as well if the patient's comfortable with that. So we'd really like to see this continue into the future. It allows us to really reach more patients. As Dr. Henry pointed out, one thing that we've been surprised of and we've learned from this transition is that we are able to see more patients via telephone and video than we were face-to-face. Because as Dr. Henry pointed out, that the transportation, the travel time, the cost of getting to our clinic is sometimes prohibitive for people who are working full-time. Their kids are in school, they're trying to get their kids to see a psychologist or psychiatrist, to get the child after school over to our clinic in the evening during traffic in Brooklyn can be a very difficult thing. We are now seeing anywhere from 10 to 15% more patients than we were face-to-face using video and telephone. So we're really, our reach has expanded. It's also allowed a lot more flexibility in when we can see patients. And I think we were able to provide more care than we were prior to COVID, when we were kind of just doing it all face-to-face.
Yes, I would definitely add to that, especially working with the child and adolescent population, especially when more parents were home, just being able to support the parents and the child there, providing tips and, kind of like recommendations for resources. And sometimes for some of our older patients, they would travel by themselves to appointments, and periodically every few weeks, if the parents, if their schedules were able to see them in person. So to be able to have them both present definitely has, we've kind of like expanded and, provided kind of even increased and better care, or more wraparound, intensive, comprehensive care that way.
Yeah, thank you for delving into that a little bit. That's a critical topic, and it's an area in which the Borough President has tried to apply advocacy to try to make these regulations more durable, realizing that they can really meet the need for people in being able to sort of see them where they are, and as you said, reduce some of the barriers for seeking care. On a topic front, I wanted to transition to see if you could speak. We're in such uncertain times with the health situation. There is, development of a vaccine, or a number of them under development, but the public really doesn't have a sense of certainty as to when that might be. And as you talked about other uncertainties in people's lives, unemployment, food insecurity has risen significantly across the city as well, and housing also an issue. So sort of many of these sort of social determinants of health and some of these other things that play into it, along with some of the just phenomenon of isolation and another of compression, where you have families living in small spaces during the shelter-in-place order, where they couldn't sort of take space for obvious reasons. So I don't know if you two can speak to some just general themes you have seen and kind of general guidance as to how people can sort of frame moving forward in their everyday lives, given that there are so many things that are uncertain.
And that is definitely very accurate, and can be one of the things that can be so difficult, because you know that at some point, you know, we will get through and on the other side of this. However, as we're in the middle of it and not quite sure where the end is, it can be, you know, there's so many things that are uncertain and out of our control. So oftentimes, as I work with patients and their families, one of the recommendations we make is focusing on the things that you can control. Whether that is, you know, how you're spending time with the family, you know, taking care of yourself physically and mentally, kind of in those, as you mentioned before, kind of sometimes there are limitations in terms of like cramped spaces, and being kind of like people have become very creative in, you know, because as the borough president had spoken earlier about kind of like, you know, the benefits of, you know, physical activity and, eating, you know, well, or just kind of like, you know, watching your diet and exercise. Those are all important things. And so families have become very creative, like obviously at first, much more kind of, for safety reasons, kind of like staying indoors, but kind of like developing schedules and, you know, kind of like, you know, figuring out spaces and times that do work for whoever is at home and in the shared space. And, you know, when there are times to kind of like, you know, take walks. So there are lots of, you know, families have become kind of like very creative, you know, as in times of needs. When there are times of crisis, you often become kind of like very creative in finding solutions as best as you can. So, but ultimately it's focusing on the things that are within, you know, the control of the, you know, the patients, the families that we serve.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, expanding on it, what Dr. Henry said, focusing on diet, exercise, mindfulness, relaxation, taking time for yourself, are going to help you manage the stressors that we're all facing. Some people are facing, you know, more than others with the financial stressors, the, you know, food insecurities, as you mentioned. Now it's, you know, there's potentially housing insecurities as well, starting to come up as the unemployment insurance has stopped. And so it's really a very stressful time. And as Dr. Henry said, kind of focusing on what you can control and ensuring that you take care of yourself through diet, exercise, mindfulness, relaxation techniques. If you can get space for yourself, do that. If you need therapy or psychiatric treatment, we have that available, and we can point people to those resources. You know, those are important aspects. And then finally, to underscore what Dr. Henry said earlier about substances, please do not turn to substances. Like that's a big, you know, that's an issue that is very prevalent in our society. And under times of stress, people may turn to using alcohol or drugs. That is going to cause more of a problem and down the road. And even though it might be an immediate stress reliever, it really actually exacerbates the stress and difficulties of the situation.
Yeah, thank you for getting into that. And I know, Dr. Henry, you talked about working with children as we just come into the last days here before some in-person schooling is set to begin. This is yet another issue families and school-age children are dealing with, is whether or not they feel comfortable having their student return to in-person instruction. And if they don't, how they will manage that in a home environment given their work situation. The other is, if you are to have your child return to in-person instruction, some of the stressors children may go through in learning new protocols or new ways to play with their cronies and these sorts of things to still be safe and manage the health situation. So perhaps you can delve into a little bit of what parents may feel on some of those things, and then what children may go through and how you've interfaced with some clients maybe who are encountering some of those things.
One of the first things for parents to keep in mind and to remember is like they don't have to have all the answers. You may not know everything, you know, you do the best that you can to, you know, depending on the age of the child, to provide appropriate accurate information, kind of like to them. I definitely recommend, because there has been so many, there's still uncertainty, even though I know school is kind of like just getting started, what the schedule will look like. I've still been talking to some IC patients kind of like even up until yesterday, and some of them still weren't sure kind of like what the plan was kind of going back. And so the decision to go back obviously is a very personal one. Sometimes there are, so many factors, whether that is, worry about kind of the health and safety of others in the house. We serve patients who live, they're multi-generations in the same household. So there may be, kind of like grandparents, et cetera, that are in the home. So the decision is certainly kind of like a personal one. But preparing kids, talking to them about what their concerns are. You'd be surprised that what a parent's concerns are may be different from what the kids' concerns are about in terms of what their worries or anxieties are about returning. Talking to them about kind of like what to anticipate, what to expect, that it will be a little bit different, but maintaining, in terms of the part about control, maintaining some safety and routine. So even if they are continuing to learn online, and even if that day is flexible, to still have them, get up and have a morning routine and take a shower and get out of bed. So really to kind of like, set them up for the day so that they're prepared. Practice even kind of like, some kids may express some anxiety around face covering with masks. So, kind of preparing them for that, for younger kids, maybe having them choose a more kind of kid-friendly one with the way it's decorated, etc. But really kind of like, checking in with the kids to make sure, kind of feeling out where they are so they can really talk about any worries or concerns that they have. And definitely try to, because there may be kids with individualized education plans or, with special needs, so that the parents have to be extra proactive, this go around in reaching out to the school, having a contact person, to make sure that they have an idea, because again, depending on parents, they may or may not be as savvy when it comes to tech, and because there's so many things online, and some kids are more kind of like internally driven and motivated than others, so they may need a little bit more supervision. So if parents are aware of all the kind of how do they access, schoolwork, et cetera, so that they're aware of that. But, to be proactive in reaching out to the schools to see, one, if there are additional services, if their kids get speech, language, other services, that those are also kind of continue to be provided in, and in what, kind of like how that is occurring, talking to, their kids to kind of like see where they're at, maintain a routine and a schedule for and then just kind of like prepare the kids for what's going to be different. You may not be able to kind of like hug your friends when you see them, that you may be able to, you may have to maintain, social distances, or you may be in the same classroom all day, which you're not used to, or, you may have a lunch, because there's some schools that may be doing the setup of being in pods. So it's going to vary. So it's kind of like having as much information as possible, outreaching to the school, having a contact in the school just in case anything comes up, being on top of it, and checking with kids to see where they are, what their worries may be, and if something that you can provide some reassurance, comfort to them, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and I don't know that I have much to add on that. I would just point out, in the chat box, I pasted a link to resources that NYU has collated for supporting families during COVID. There's a lot of information there from the Department of Child Psychiatry and Department of Psychiatry, a lot of articles and resources. If you want to share that link, it's really accessible to anyone.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm sure there are ways where we can, our programs team or our communications team can help amplify the link with the resources to try to move that out to constituents. And to just touch on a couple of things that Dr. Henry highlighted, it sounds like for helping form a routine or continuing a routine for kids, and I'm guessing for adults as well, some semblance of comfort in an everyday routine. And the other is, as you talked about with school, restarting, devising a plan of, even though there is some still moving parts, what the plan may be and points of contact so as to create some options in outreach should some of the things change, and how to manage those things, along with sort of, as you said, everyday check-ins or check-ins with your kids about how they're doing. Another topic I wanted to raise is pandemic fatigue. So we've been going through health protocols now for about 6 months in earnest, more or less. And that has gone through significant periods, as you talked about, of isolation and of the city shutting down in large part. And as we saw over the midst of the summer, more people were outside. Mask adherence or adherence to some other protocols was seemingly lax or lower in some times. And it seemed perhaps that there was just people wanted to be outside, they wanted to socialize, and they wanted to restart and return to quote unquote some sense of normalcy as they could. And so we're still in altered guidance with outdoor dining and some of these things being adapted. But what have you seen in your clients as far as just being frustrated that this is still continuing? There's not a sort of switch to turn it on and off as far as the regulations, even though they are they're moving along in phases.
I would say that I'll start. Feel free to jump in, Dr. Frankel. One of the things that I've seen, there's definitely been some fatigue, like, especially with the kids. Initially, there may have been kind of excitement of like, oh, I'm not like going to school. What I've actually encountered, like I've seen both, is like kids who didn't like school are really looking forward to going back to school. I don't know how long it lasts, but there definitely has been some of that. Like, I think being out of it, and it's so rare to, have the opportunity or, to be in a time like this where there was such a big transition for everyone. And so to kind of, they didn't recognize kind of like the function of that routine. And so many of them were kind of like missing that and looking forward to that. And, kids, being in school and being around to provide some, like the social and emotional kind of aspects of learning that school and being around peers can provide. But for not all kids love school. Some of them deal with bullying, et cetera. And so again, some of them being home, they appreciated kind of like, that aspect of it. But there has been some fatigue in terms of just being in the house. And so I think some of the ease of being able to go outside, but again, focusing on the things that you can control. So it's kind of like you wear your face mask, you may see other people who don't, but kind of like, do the things that, that will allow you to kind of have some sense of like, for lack of a better word, back to like some normalcy, being out, taking care of yourself. And again, it goes back to kind of like the underlying focus, because we're not sure of what, like what the timeline is in terms of vaccines, et cetera. And so it is dealing with the fatigue, being patient with yourself, acknowledging that it sucks. And, like it's the, like that's okay. And again, finding the time, after you've acknowledged that, okay, so what can I do? What can I do to, for the next hour? What can I do for the next half an hour? What are my options? Can I, take a walk around the block? Can I, if you have pets, taking a walk with your pet and kind of like, coming back. So again, it's kind of like, it may be kind of like small things that can be very effective. And think about it in terms of looking at months or, where this is going to be like, 6 months, 3 months, since we're not sure. Focusing on, being mindful and being in the present. What can I do now? What can be effective now? What can I do to kind of like help right now?
Yeah, I think that's great. And there is, in my patients, I don't see kids, I see adults. There's definitely, many of them have experienced this fatigue of just having enough of this. It's been a long time for many people working from home. They're working from home while their kids are home. They're working from home while their kids are in school in the spring, doing remote schooling. Their spouses are home. As Dr. Henry said, many are in multi-generational homes, so that's also very tough to kind of balance that work and life issues. The point as a psychiatrist, I'd like to underscore for people is that you do have to do a self-assessment and make sure that if that fatigue is transitioning into something more serious, like depression or PTSD, or you do have to seek out help. So kind of thinking about what signs should you be looking for? When is it time to start to seek out help? So if you're having kind of ongoing sadness, depression, apathy, nothing really matters to you anymore, becoming easily frustrated or irritable, just not having any, a lack of feeling or emotion when you get good news, it doesn't seem to make you happy. Really disconnecting from people, so stopping those outreaches that you were doing via the video or telephone, feeling like a failure, and then obviously any thoughts of suicide or self-harm. That's a very big warning sign that it's time to connect with a specialist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, come into the emergency department. So I just want to underscore that, yes, we're all feeling a lot of fatigue and stressed with this ongoing pandemic that does look like it'll be going into 2021, depending on when we can start to get the vaccines and more testing rolled out, et cetera. But we do have to notice when that transitions from just, yeah, we're all feeling this, to, wow, that's a little more serious, and maybe I should seek some treatment, either for yourself or for loved ones and family members.
Yeah, thanks so much for raising that, Dr. Frankel. Dr. Henry, do you have anything else you want to add as far as warning signs parents should or can be aware of or be observant of in their kids or in a family environment, aside from what Dr. Frankel said about kind of a self-assessment if some of these things veer into a different territory or linger on? Anything else that you'd want to highlight that people can look out for?
A couple of things I would add would just be kind of like, if you have kids, like younger kids who, have been toilet trained and, are usually kind of pretty independent, but, seem to be a little bit more anxious, kind of separating. If they start to kind of all their bathroom and toileting, which they had kind of had control over, suddenly that you find, there's a regression. They're not eating, or I seem to be isolating more, even when you try to kind of like invite them into any activities within the family, within the household, if you're noticing any of that. So any kind of like withdrawn behavior, or the opposite, if there's, we have had seen, again, just like anecdotally, there has been, there may be some increase of, kids with using vapes and, kind of like marijuana use, et cetera. So kind of like, just being mindful of some of those behaviors. If it's seen like withdrawn, isolated, secretive, more clingy, more tearful, sleep patterns being different, kind of like sleeping so much or not being able to go to bed, would be something to kind of like be alert for. And just kind of like be mindful when thinking about fatigue. There can be also, because there's been so much transition with technology, there is like a fatigue with just using technology, screen time. So being able to kind of like monitor that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting some additions to that. Dr. Frankel, you raised one thing about multi-generational families or living in various types of housing situations that may cause stress, or as you said, working, Dr. Henry, working and living in the same place for extended periods with your kids also working in the same place for their school day. Just on a everyday management basis, are there any small tips you would offer to to families or to parents with kids that are school aged in just managing the day-to-day stress of getting through, from the 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. period, should they be at home a lot, trying to manage, as you said, technology and dealing with the frustrations that may ensue on both sides of those things, for both the adult and for the child as they cope with technology or other platforms that they may need to use. So anything on the day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think what Dr. Henry, sorry, I was going to say what you had said already, which is kind of really keeping a routine and schedule as best as possible. I also think, recognizing that this is difficult for everyone, for the kids, for the teachers, for the parents, and cutting yourself a little bit of slack on that. Some kids are going to do well with this remote learning or with this situation when they go back to the school. Some kids won't do as well with one or the other, but they'll, they can figure it out. And they might do well some days and not others, because they may shift. But I'll let Dr. Henry jump in as well.
Yeah, and I would just definitely would just kind of like reinforce that it's definitely maintaining the schedule, giving yourself a break, ease up on some expectations sometimes. I think is that sometimes parents, wanting to do and be everything, and it's a strain on everyone. It's a very new way of being on a daily basis. As Dr. Franklin had mentioned before, just kind of like, take a moment to do some self-assessment, just to kind of check in with yourself and see how you're feeling, how you're doing, how you're managing. Do you need to kind of like reach out to someone, a professional, for additional ways of managing and coping if the stress is becoming too much? And again, trying to maintain and manage a schedule and just recognize that it's hard.
Yeah, appreciate that. I wanted to just check in with our programs team to see if they have any questions that have populated or questions that they want to ask. So Glenda and Denise, Lori, Mike, anybody on the program side that is fielding the questions, any questions that we can raise for the doctors?
Yeah, I have, thank you, Nate. I have a few questions that were submitted prior to the broadcast. So the first question that I have is, will people who are diagnosed with COVID-19 suffer with blood clots, and will this be a severe event?
That's a good question. It's a bit out of our area of expertise. I do know that here the neurology service has been doing a lot of research in that area. Many people have probably heard in the general news that there is an association between COVID-19 and strokes and blood clots, and that might be one of the things which is causing the increased mortality and morbidity with this illness. But as a psychiatrist, I think it's a little tough for us for myself to comment on it, and I'm assuming for Dr. Henry as well.
Okay, thank you. The second question I have is, how can we educate ourselves and our generations on mental health, and what should we keep in mind when dealing with mental illness? And the second part of the question is also, how can we deal with the fear that autistic kids deal with? So that's a compound question.
I'll take the first part, and I'll let the child psychologist take the second part. So one thing that I really want to advocate for and try to is to really break down the stigma of mental illness and mental health issues. That's what we need to do in this generation and moving forward. We need to make going for treatment for a psychiatric or mental health issue as reasonable as going to the doctor for a heart issue or a lung issue. And that's very important so that people don't feel like they should be ashamed of going to see a psychiatrist or psychologist, that they can recognize that, yeah, I need some help, and there are these resources available, and it's time to get that help, as you would for any medical condition. And it varies. In some communities, it's very open to seeing a psychiatrist. In other communities, they it's kind of shunned and looked down upon. So anything we can do to reduce the stigma of getting treatment for psychiatric illness and mental illness, I think would go a long way. And I'll let Dr. Henry jump in on the autism question.
Can you repeat the question? I think I remember, but I just want to make sure that I'm answering accurately.
Sure. It says, how can you deal with the fear that autistic kids deal with?
It's a very general, it's a very broad question, so I'll answer, I guess, kind of like broadly. It depends. If the child that's been diagnosed with autism, is experiencing fear, one, if the parents are getting, there's so many great resources through Autism Speaks. They have a lot of like resources just for parents. They, whether, for advocating for kind of like additional service. And kind of, to help, the kids, whether it's to help to express their emotions, to help kind of, communicate, because autism, it's a spectrum. So some kids are able to communicate and, kind of be more verbal than others. And so in terms of how they're voicing their fears or how their parents kind of like help to manage or mitigate that, it's going to depend on that child. But there are lots of resources that can be, kind of like access to kind of like to help parents and families deal with that. And Autism Speaks, our clinic, that's is there we see some kids with autism, if they're experiencing some, the primary diagnosis is more kind of like depression or anxiety along with the autism. But if it's primarily autism, that's not the population that we serve at the behavioral health clinic at 49th Street. But, just for general resources and kind of like how to manage, I would definitely point to kind of like Autism Speaks as to provide a lot of resources.
Thank you.
And just again, to the point, in that link I sent out, there's actually a story or a news blurb from the child psychiatry department saying supporting your child with autism through COVID-19. So that's a separate, I can actually put that into the, I'll email that link or put that link as well into the chat if you want to pass that along.
Great, yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you.
There may be some more resources also through, I know the Child Study Center, which is a program in Manhattan that serves children. They do work a lot with kids who have been diagnosed with autism, and so that would be a good resource as well at NYU.
Awesome. Another submitted question I have is, how do you tell your doctor after making too many mistakes to get checked for dementia?
I'll leave that to Dr. Frank.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess the question is, someone themselves is concerned that they're forgetful, they're making mistakes, and they want to get checked out for whether or not they might have a dementia. So first of all, I'd say there are lots of potential reasons why people become forgetful or making mistakes that go from the very mundane to not getting enough sleep and not being rested enough, to all the way to early dementia and so forth. And there's a lot in between, including depression. If someone gets depressed, they can have some cognitive impairments, difficulty in focusing and concentrating, so they end up making a lot of mistakes. So the thing you can ask your doctor for is you can let them know that you're having these troubles, you're worried about it. There can also be medications which cause those issues, so that's something to talk to your doctor about as well. Are any of the medications I'm taking potentially causing these memory difficulties or cognitive impairments? So talk about that with your doctor. And then you can also ask for something called neuropsychological testing, which is a more formal test of your ability to do mental tasks, including memory, but also planning and other cognitive tasks that will give a really full breakdown as to whether or not you are having something which would be need further investigation or treatment, or whether there's specific discrete areas of your thinking or cognition or focus or memory that are causing problems that might be able to be addressed in different ways. So that's called neuropsychological testing. There are psychologists who specialize in that. Your primary care doctor should be able to refer you to one of those. And they're called neuropsychologists, and they do neuropsych testing.
Thank you. The other submitted question I have is, are there phone options for seniors to speak if a senior is to a mental health profession if they do not have technology to do virtual visits?
Yeah, so when I talked about the fact that we switched over largely to virtual visits, and that some people have struggled with the video technology, I don't want to kind of lump one group into it, but it does seem that individuals on the older age range, the older age spectrum, either don't have the technology, aren't used to it, don't use the video as much. So they do just do phone consultations with our psychiatrists or psychologists. And so there's many people just doing phone assessments and treatment. So that's possible. That's possible in our clinic. I'm assuming it's possible in other clinics, across the state.
So how would they check with their healthcare provider?
So yeah, they can ask their primary care doctor for a referral to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or someone for a mental health evaluation. And those clinics if they get the number for the clinic, they can call the clinic and they can explain, look, I'd like to have the evaluation. I don't want to come face to face. Can we do a video or can we do a telephone evaluation rather than the video evaluation? Most clinics should be able to manage that. I know if you called our main clinic, we would be able to kind of walk them through the process of getting that set up and scheduling a telephone appointment.
Okay, thank you. My other submitted question is, do you have any advice for teachers who may see mental health issues with their students as they come back to school or continue at home learning?
Yes, and teachers are usually like a huge referral source. And at NYU, we actually have a school-based mental health, behavioral health program, and where social workers are providing mental health services for students on those campuses. I think it's about 20 campuses, elementary all the way through high school, all around Brooklyn. So, they can talk to parents about their concerns. If there is a school-based health center within the school, they can make a referral there as well. And, teachers are always a great resource for so much other than, their function as teachers. And so, they're usually, pretty good about kind of like spotting, but just know that they do have options. The school-based health centers, whether it's through NYU or other programs, talking to the parents, expressing what their concerns are and maybe suggesting that the child get a, evaluation or talk to someone.
Thank you. The last question I have is, what are some of the best steps to keeping healthy during this difficult time?
Yeah, I think that, so for mental health, we've covered some of this, but just to kind of reiterate the points that are really important, getting an adequate good night's sleep, making sure you're fully rested, eating well, trying to eat healthy, balanced diet, not overeating, getting some form of exercise, whether that's just walking outside, running, whatever you can do to, bike, anything you can do to kind of get yourself outside for a half an hour a day, if not longer. Taking time for yourself to relax, do some mindfulness, take a break and reduce screen time. I'll speak for myself personally. One of the things that I noticed is cutting off from the news is a good thing for me. Like I get enough news. I don't need to hear it all day. I don't need to be checking Twitter all the time to find out what exactly is happening every moment. It becomes a barrage of information that's really tough to manage. So just kind of So for me, what worked is saying, okay, I'm going to just check the news in the evening, and that's where I'll get my news, and I don't have to check it all day. but trying to do things like that to separate out things that, screen time, news, making sure you're keeping yourself as best as possible on a schedule. All things will help maintain mental wellness. And then mindfulness and meditation are really wonderful modalities to help ease stress and help people manage. There are a lot of resources on the internet and on apps for mindfulness and relaxation, which I would highly encourage people to download and use. Many of them have a free trial option or a free element that you can get. You don't have to pay for them.
And one of the great things about sort of mindfulness type, activities is it doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter how many people are around, there are various options that you can have that you can utilize to help manage.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Denise. Yeah, and thank you for all the folks who submitted questions. Before we close, I wanted to see if we could address, we're about to head into holiday season. As the fall months come, that includes many holidays that many constituents celebrate of all types. And so these can create stressors during normal times and perhaps additional stressors this year if folks are not able to travel to see their families or they may just celebrate in new ways. And so I wanted to just see if you have any tips or ways where constituents can keep in mind as they move into the holiday period for many people about how to manage maybe new stressors along with the some of the typical ones that come with that period.
I think it's just bearing in mind too that, there may be many, just like learning to manage the disappointments in potentially, limiting travel or family around and, coming up with ways that you can still mark the occasion or that you can still reach out to others. Quarantining and social distancing doesn't have to mean total isolation. If you can reach out to friends, family members, people in the community, and one of the things that COVID has actually done that I've noticed is whatever sector, there are resources that are potentially there that weren't there before, or at least easier to access. And so for, kind of families to kind of like bear that in mind, as well, and just anticipate that, it may be a different holiday season. And again, recognizing and, kind of like bearing in mind the realities of that and, as well as kind of like recognizing, okay, what are some of the other ways that we can kind of like help manage, mitigate, acknowledging the disappointment or the differences, while still celebrating in some way and reaching out for help again, if it's needed, and getting support.
Yeah, I think I would agree with all that. Expectation management, to just, manage what you expect for the holidays that you're going to be heading into, so that your expectations are realistic given the circumstances we find ourselves in. Because they are going to be difficult for everyone, no matter which holidays you're celebrating. It's not going to be the same. And expectation management is going to be a big part of that, and everything else Dr. Henry said.
Yeah, thank you so much for addressing that. And as you both alluded to earlier, reaching out if you need assistance to try to understand ways you can do that. So yeah, using some of the free resources that we can help amplify online, and then yeah, helping with parents, families, and adults, trying to connect them with resources as time goes on and as needs arise. Any final notes you'd like to add or things you'd like to share with the audience before we close? I think that concludes our questions from constituents, but any other notes, Dr. Frankel or Dr. Henry, you'd like to add?
I'd just like to say thank you to everyone. I mean, it's really been a pleasure to do this. We're happy to help in any way possible. You can reach out to us through the Department of Psychiatry at NYU Langone or the family health centers at NYU Langone, and we have resources here if anyone needs.
Yes, I'd agree. Thank you. I really appreciated being a part of this, and hopefully, you know, the information that was provided was useful. And one day at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for being generous with your time today. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Glenda and Lori and the programs team if you have any final notes as well.
Yes. Hi, thank you, Nate. Thank you, doctors, for your expertise, your shared resources and insight of mental health and mental wellness. Thank you, profusely, thank you, profoundly thank you for joining us today. And Nate, thank you for moderating. I'd like to just acknowledge and give also thanks to our audience members for joining. Please tell a friend to join us for our next Wellness Wednesday session, same time next Wednesday. And until next time, so be well, keep safe, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.